You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On a blustery November morning in 2007, a medical investigator from the Minnesota Department of Health inspected the slaughterhouse floor of a pork processing plant. She was there to investigate a troubling outbreak. Over the past year, multiple employees had suffered severe nerve damage. It was so bad that some of them had even been paralyzed, and so far, nobody knew what was causing it. As the plant's CEO showed the investigator around, she carefully examined every step of the processing line, and she couldn't believe how quickly the dead pigs were broken down into various cuts of meat. The employees barely had time to finish their tasks before a new pig arrived in front of them. But otherwise, the investigator thought that everything else seemed to be clean and orderly. That was, until she saw something so horrifying it made her stop in her tracks. She had never seen something so gruesome, so barbaric, so unsanitary in her whole life. And if her suspicions were right, this was the reason behind the dangerous outbreak. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please invite the follow button to join your hacky sack circle, but instead of serving them the hacky sack, just throw them a live tarantula. This episode is called The Mist. On December 10th, 2006, a slight man in his 20s with thick black hair stood shivering as he worked on the slaughterhouse floor at Quality Pork Processors in Austin, Minnesota. Machinery clanked in the background, and the metallic smell of fresh blood and acrid bleach hung in the air. The man, whose name was Javier, felt the freezing wind blow in from the loading docks and seep through the thin white lab coat he wore over his clothes. But Javier wasn't just cold. His muscles ached, he felt like he might have a fever, and his hands and feet tingled as if they were asleep. He hoped he wasn't coming down with the flu. He stomped his feet and tried to shake the tingling sensation out of his hands, but that didn't help. Javier's workstation was the last stop on a conveyor line that snaked its way through a large room. On this line, workers systematically carved up each hog carcass into roughly 150 pounds of pork, sausage, bacon, and other cuts of meat. Javier stood shoulder to shoulder at a long table with two other workers. A young woman named Maria was to his right, and on his left was an older man named Carlos. And the three of them, their job was to process the pigs' heads. All three of them wore rubber boots and safety glasses, and their lab coats were pretty much always stained with blood and gore. Maria and Carlos looked up as Javier kept stomping his feet, but they quickly forgot about him and returned their attention to the work in front of them. A new pig head came down the line about every 3 seconds, and there really wasn't time to make conversation. Javier had started this job 3 months earlier after moving all the way from Oaxaca, Mexico. Someone he knew from his hometown had moved here to Austin, Minnesota first, and then sent word back home to Mexico saying there were lots of good jobs here. And so, the town of Austin, Minnesota had now filled up with friends and relatives from the same area in Mexico. Javier and his wife, Anna, had decided to take a risk and follow all these people going to Minnesota. They'd packed up their entire lives and brought their 2 young kids. The freezing winter was a huge adjustment, and it was hard to be in a place where they didn't speak the same language. But Javier was learning English as quickly as he could, and for now he was lucky that most of his coworkers were Latino as well, so he could speak Spanish at work. And so Javier and Anna were quickly becoming part of a tight-knit Mexican community in Minnesota. Javier, who loved basketball, had even found a few friends to play pickup games with on the weekends when it was warm enough outside. And so all in all, Javier was happy with his new life in Minnesota. He was glad to have his job at the meatpacking plant, even though it was totally physically punishing. Everyone on the processing line did the same thing over and over and over again all day long. Javier knew that many of his coworkers suffered from repetitive motion injuries, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, which causes numbness, tingling, and pain in the hand and forearm. But on that cold December day, Javier tried not to focus on his aching, tingling limbs. There was a nurse on duty at the plant, but he didn't want to risk being sent home. He didn't have many sick days left, and he really needed the paycheck. His family needed winter clothes, and their expenses were much higher in Austin, Minnesota than they had been back in Mexico. So despite how horrible he felt, Javier remained in his place between Maria and Carlos at the end of the processing line. He turned his attention to the work in front of him and finished his shift before heading home. The next day, Javier woke up in his apartment, shivering under his blanket. Before he even opened his eyes, he realized that he still felt achy and his hands were still very tingly, and it was an odd sensation in his hands, almost like his hands belonged to someone else. As Javier pulled the blanket closer to his body, he immediately felt that same feverish chill that he'd had the previous day at the plant. Javier desperately just wanted to go back to sleep, but he knew he couldn't. He had to go to work. Javier finally opened his eyes and tried to swing his legs towards the edge of the bed, but nothing happened. His legs remained still. He tried to tense the muscles, but felt no response. With his heart racing, he sat up and grabbed at his thighs with his hands, and to Javier's horror, they just felt like dead weight. No matter what he did, he couldn't get his legs to move. Javier frantically yelled out that he couldn't feel his legs. His wife, Anna, rushed inside with a look of deep concern on her face. Cold sweat started dripping from Javier's brow as the realization of his situation sunk in. He told Anna that he needed to go to the hospital right now. The couple didn't have a car, so Anna called a taxi, and then she and their kids literally carried Javier from his bed to the cab. Javier did his best to keep a brave face on for his family, but when he looked over at his wife, he could tell how scared she was. When Javier and Anna arrived at the Austin Medical Center, which was just a few miles from their apartment, medical technicians lifted Javier onto a gurney and wheeled him into an exam room. A few minutes later, a doctor entered the room, followed by an interpreter who greeted Javier in Spanish and said her name was Carol. For the next few minutes, the doctor and Javier discussed his symptoms as Carol translated their statements. Finally, the doctor said something to Carol, and then the doctor left the room. Javier could hear him making a phone call from his office across the hallway. Carol leaned into Javier and explained that the doctor suspected that Javier had nerve damage, but he didn't know what had caused it, and the Austin Medical Center was not really equipped to treat it. The doctor had recommended that Javier be transferred to the Mayo Clinic, a larger medical center about 50 miles away in Rochester, Minnesota. He was making those arrangements now. Javier looked over at Anna as she squeezed his hand. He didn't want to go so far away from her and the kids, but he needed to get better so he could go back to work. Javier looked back at Carol and nodded. He would go to the Mayo Clinic. Two weeks later, Javier lay in a hospital bed at the Mayo Clinic, looking out the window at the falling snow. It was Christmas Day, and Javier wished he could be home celebrating with his family. He had spent the past 2 weeks having countless blood tests, being rolled in and out of MRI machines, and feeling needle pokes at his veins. But he didn't feel much better, and he still couldn't move his legs. The doctors explained that his spinal cord was severely inflamed, which was causing his symptoms. However, the doctor said that they still had no idea why, except that it had to do with Javier's own immune system. For some reason, it was attacking his own nerves instead of helping to keep him healthy. A nurse walked into the room and checked Javier's IV drip. Javier was being treated with steroids, which are powerful chemicals that reduce swelling in the human body. His doctors had promised Javier that steroids would bring some relief to his spinal cord, although they probably would not completely cure his mysterious ailment. Javier winced as he remembered the doctor who told him that he might spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. The thought of that filled Javier with dread. If he couldn't walk, then he would not be able to keep working at the meat processing plant. He would have no way to make a living for Anna and the kids, and he would become dead weight to his whole family. Javier thought that he and Anna had come too far and worked too hard to give up now. And so he looked down at his tingling legs, and with all his might, he tried to move them, and just then he saw he could wiggle his toes. Just a little. Wasn't much, but it was a start. Javier decided he would do everything he could to try to get back on his feet. As Javier was struggling to recover, Carol Hidalgo, the translator at the Austin Medical Center, walked into a small exam room with a doctor to help out a new patient. It was early in the spring of 2007, about 4 months after Javier had first been hospitalized, and Carol was always extremely busy. This area had a lot of Spanish-speaking residents, so she was constantly translating for the hospital's medical staff. It was tiring work, but Carol enjoyed it. She felt like she was a problem solver. The latest patient was a tired-looking man in his 40s who worked at the quality pork processors plant with Javier. The man, whose name was Carlos, the man who stood next to Javier on the processing line, rubbed his legs as he explained that he'd been feeling weak and experiencing tingling in his limbs for over a month now. Carol listened carefully and relayed his symptoms to the doctor. Carlos said that his right hip and thigh were throbbing, and it was as if the soles of his feet were on fire. At first, he thought he was just tired from standing all day long, but now he was having trouble walking. Carlos said that he barely had the energy to do his job, but he desperately needed the money. His family's trailer home had burned down in the winter, and he was putting in extra hours to try to afford the rent on their new home. Carol's heart broke for him. She saw a lot of patients like Carlos. They worked so hard in order to make a better life for their families, but it was often at their body's expense. Their bodies often broke down as a result of the grueling work. She translated his story for the doctor, who nodded and told Carol to let Carlos know she was going to examine his legs. And when she was done, she shook her head and said that she'd need to run more tests. Carlos's muscles seemed fine, and so the doctor suspected that his problems were actually a nerve issue. As the doctor was speaking, Carol frowned. Something about this sounded familiar, but she couldn't exactly place what it was. And anyways, she saw so many patients every single day that it really wasn't that surprising that people's symptoms kind of bleeded together and sounded similar. So Carol jotted down some notes, and then she shook Carlos's hand and told him she hoped that he would feel better soon. Carol followed the doctor out of the room. Austin Medical Center was very crowded that day, and Carol had another patient that she needed to help. In May of 2007, so about 5 months after Javier first got sick, Javier proudly walked back through the quality pork processor's plant doors with a huge smile on his face. For months, his family had survived on their tiny savings and the charity of friends and neighbors. His doctors still didn't know what had made him sick, but the steroid treatments had reduced the inflammation in his spinal cord, and with intense and very painful physical therapy, Javier had slowly learned to walk again, even though he did still need a cane for balance. But his doctors thought he was well enough to work again, and the plant had cleared him to come back. Javier yelled greetings to his co-workers, Maria and Carlos, over the very noisy machinery, and right away Javier noticed that they both looked very tired and were moving so stiffly. But there really wasn't time to talk. It was time to get back to work. Javier was the happiest he'd been since that horrible day in December when he first got sick. But despite the progress he had made, Javier still was not fully healed. While he had regained control of his legs, he had not regained control of his bladder. So he had to wear a catheter, a tube that collected his urine in a bag. The bag was taped to his leg under his pants, so it wouldn't be noticeable to anyone. Javier took a deep breath, stepped up to his old place in the assembly line, and got back to work. 3 weeks later, Javier sat on a bench outside the factory during his lunch break, resting in the sun. Since he had come back to work, the pain in his legs had returned. He knew his body wasn't as strong as it used to be, and he hoped it was just part of the healing process. As Javier tried to relax, Maria, the woman who worked with him on the processing line, walked over and eased down next to him. She groaned and rubbed her legs. She told Javier she had a knot in her calf that just wouldn't go away, and her arms were feeling so heavy. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she told Javier that her arms were so sore she could barely hold up the spoon to feed her baby daughter when she was at home. She said their colleague, Carlos, was struggling too, but he was trying to work through the pain. Suddenly, a whistle blew, which meant the lunch break was over. Javier watched as Maria slowly stood up and stretched, and then Javier tried to get up too, but suddenly his legs gave out from under him. He tried to stand up again, but his legs just wouldn't move. Javier told Maria to please go get help. He needed a doctor immediately. 3 months later, in September of 2007, Carol, the translator at Austin Medical Center, was in the emergency room helping a young woman named Maria, the same Maria who worked next to Javier at the QPP processing plant. Carol couldn't believe that Maria was sitting in a wheelchair. Just a few months earlier, she'd seen the young mother for another exam, and she seemed fine. Now, Maria could hardly stand up and needed help to get on the exam table, and when she tried to sign an authorization form, she couldn't even hold the pen. Maria said that it felt like her right arm had fallen asleep, and her feet were completely numb and tingling. A doctor came into the room and performed an examination. He tested Maria's reflexes and then arranged for additional blood tests. Then he had Carol tell Maria that he did have a diagnosis. Maria had a condition called neuropathy, which is a general term for nerve damage. It explained her weakness, numbness, and pain. He didn't know what was causing it, but he was still prescribing her steroids. After the doctor left, Carol, the translator, could see that Maria seemed unsure what to do. In a quiet voice, Maria told Carol that she was scared. A lot of her colleagues were getting sick too. One of them had even lost movement of his legs twice. Carol gave her a hug and promised her that the doctors would find an answer. Then she helped Maria back into her wheelchair and wheeled her to the elevator. After Maria left, Carol returned to the treatment area, deep in thought. Carol liked to write while she puzzled things out in her head. She sat in a chair and took out her notebook and a pen, and she watched people rush by in the hallway. She realized that she had translated for several patients over the past few months who all had very similar symptoms. There was Maria, who just a few months ago was walking but now could barely move, and then there was Carlos, whose feet felt like they were burning, and then there was Javier, whose legs had stopped working altogether. She scribbled down the first thing that they had in common. They had all been diagnosed with a type of neuropathy, and so Carol wondered if maybe something else connected these patients. Carol knew that each of these patients had different doctors and nurses, and these doctors and nurses rarely talked about their patients to each other. As a translator, Carol might be the only person in the clinic who knew that these patients had been diagnosed with the same problems. Just then, Carol spotted the chair of general medicine, Dr. Richard Schindler, walk by in the hallway. Carol knew he valued the opinions of everyone on his staff. He always found the time to talk. Carol ran after him and asked if he had a moment to chat. He nodded and said that he did. Then Carol took a breath and she asked him, "What causes neuropathy?" Carol had heard the diagnosis before, but she'd never quite understood it. He smiled at her and said that one of the most common causes of neuropathy was diabetes. Carol shook her head. She knew that Javier didn't have diabetes, and neither did Carlos or Maria. Dr. Schindler then told her that neuropathy can also result from traumatic injuries, exposure to toxins, and from infections. Dr. Schindler asked Carol why she was interested, and she told him that she'd translated for at least 3 patients who were all diagnosed with neuropathy. Carol was almost certain they all worked at the same pork processing plant. She thought there might be more she had forgotten about, but she needed his help to get a better understanding of their diagnosis. Dr. Schindler's expression grew thoughtful, and he told Carol to please find him later and he would help her try to figure it out. And so, later that afternoon, Carol and Dr. Schindler sat down together and went over the files of every patient that had been diagnosed with neuropathy in the past year. Carol could see Dr. Schindler's face grow anxious as they sifted through the names and charts. By the end of the day, he and Carol had identified 6 different cases of neuropathy that all seemed to be linked. Not only did they all work at quality pork processors, but they all worked in the same area of the processing line. Dr. Schindler thanked Carol for paying such close attention to the patients, and Carol told him that all she wanted was to figure out what was making them sick. She saw firsthand how much their jobs meant to them and their families. Carol just hoped that there was still time to help them before they became permanently paralyzed or worse. The next morning, after going through the patient files, Dr. Schindler picked up the phone to call the pork processing plant. He reached the factory's nurse and introduced himself and then explained the situation. He said several workers from her plant who were suffering from neuropathy had come to his clinic to be treated, and so now he needed to know if maybe other people who worked at this plant had maybe come to her with the same symptoms. He could hear the nurse pause for a moment, and then she said that she did remember some workers coming to her with tingling and soreness in their limbs, and she gave Dr. Schindler their names. He added them to the list of patients that he and Carol had already identified, making a total of more than 11 workers from this plant who all had similar symptoms. Dr. Schindler thanked the nurse for her help, and then they hung up. Clearly, there was something wrong at this pork processing plant, but the doctor didn't know what it was. He wondered if maybe workers were reacting to a vaccination, or maybe they had an infectious illness, or they'd been exposed to neurotoxic chemicals. He didn't know, but there was something there. Something was going on at this plant. Dr. Schindler realized that this could quickly turn into a huge medical investigation, one beyond the scope of just a small regional facility like the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center. And so the doctor sent out an email to Mayo Clinic, a much bigger clinic, which was where Javier had been treated. It was one of the best medical facilities in the state, and if anyone could help with this investigation that was about to start, it was them. Doctors at the Mayo Clinic quickly brought all 11 affected workers into their clinic one by one to test them for a long list of diseases and disorders. But all of the tests proved to be negative. Dr. Schindler reviewed the results with a growing sense of frustration. Within just a few months, these once healthy workers now had to use wheelchairs or had lost sensation in their arms, legs, or hands. It couldn't be a simple muscular disorder like carpal tunnel syndrome or any other repetitive stress injury. It wasn't a reaction to a vaccination, cancer, or a virus. It also was not a bacteria or a parasite. There had to be something happening at the pork processing plant, but no one at the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center or the Mayo Clinic could figure it out. Dr. Schindler realized that if he was going to get to the bottom of why people who worked at this plant were getting so sick, he would need more help. It was time to call the Minnesota Department of Health. On November 28, 2007, around 2 months after Carol, the interpreter, realized that something at the plant was making all these people sick, Dr. Ruth Linfield, the Minnesota state epidemiologist, pulled her car into Quality Pork Processing's parking lot. At the same time, several other cars drove into the lot and parked right next to her. Dr. Linfield was there to lead an inspection of the meat processing line. She'd brought with her a delegation of 3 animal health experts, a medical detective, an infection control specialist, and a toxicologist. Whatever was causing the workers at this plant to get sick, Dr. Linfield and her team were confident they would figure out what it was. The company's CEO, a man named Kelly Wadding, along with the head of HR and the company nurse, stepped forward to greet their visitors and lead them into the factory. Dr. Linfield stepped into the entry with the rest of the team, and she pulled protective gear over her dark gray business suit. Plastic gloves, booties, masks, and plastic gowns. Then she followed the CEO, Kelly Wadding, out onto the factory floor, and the inspection began. First, the investigators were escorted through the entry room, where enormous pigs weighing about 250 pounds were stunned and then slaughtered. After the pigs were slaughtered, their blood was drained and their carcasses were thoroughly cleaned. From the entry room, the group moved into the section called the warm room, where the carcasses were hung by their rear legs and butchered into different parts. As the investigators followed the path of the pig carcasses around the warm room, Dr. Linfield and her team observed the tasks being performed at each workstation. Each worker made a particular cut in the hog carcass. Some used machinery, and others used large knives. It was messy and repetitive, but so far, Dr. Linfield hadn't seen anything that could cause an outbreak of disease. Finally, at a section near the end of the line, the group came to a large table. About 35 workers were gathered there, removing the last bit of meat from the hog using a specialized device. A pink mist hung over the table. Dr. Linfield stopped walking and looked down at her plastic white gown. She could see all these tiny pink particles settling on her arms, chest, and shoulders. Then she looked back at the assembly line and was horrified by what she was seeing. And within minutes, the company's CEO, Kelly Wadding, had shut the entire plant down. Dr. Linfield was looking at what quality pork processors called the head table, where workers literally took apart the pig's head piece by piece. They cut out the snout, the ears, tongues, cheeks, and jaws of each hog using knives, chisels, and automatic cutting tools. But the part of the process that horrified Dr. Linfield was the very last step, when workers removed the pig's brain. Like the rest of the pig's body, its brain is a marketable product. People in some parts of the world will use pig brain to thicken their stir-fry, while other people scramble pig brain in with eggs. But because the plant processed the pigs so rapidly, the plant needed an efficient, easy way to extract the brains from the pigs' skulls. They came up with a unique method to get the brain out, which only a few other factories in the world had even tried. Under the company's unusual process, the brain removal workers were required to blast pressurized air into a hole in the pig's skull. And then the brain poured out of that same hole the air went in, now a gooey pink substance that kind of resembled Pepto-Bismol or a lumpy strawberry milkshake. And workers were blasting pig brains at an incredible speed, liquefying about 22 brains every minute. It was a gruesome process, to be sure, but what caught Dr. Linfield's attention was something else. It was the pink mist that hovered around the whole head table and then lightly coated the rest of the room thanks to the air currents from the fan above them. That pink mist was created by tiny particles of pig brain. The air gun that workers used to liquefy the brain was so strong that some of the brain became vaporized and basically floated up into the air. None of the workers wore any kind of breathing protection, such as respirators or face masks, so everyone in the room, but especially those who worked at the head table, and even more so the actual brain removal workers, were inhaling particles from 1,350 aerosolized pig brains every hour. Javier was a brain removal worker, and Carlos and Maria worked very close to his station. In fact, almost all the workers who got sick were stationed right near the brain removal machine. Dr. Linfield's team discovered that all of these workers were suffering from a brand new disease, which was given the name progressive inflammatory neuropathy. As a result of their massive exposure to aerosolized pig brain matter, their immune systems were constantly creating antibodies to neutralize the foreign proteins. But because these animal cells were very similar to human cells, the antibodies ended up attacking their own nerve cells as well, and over time, the disease could do enough damage to leave victims confined to a wheelchair. Kelly Wadding, the pork processing CEO, shut off the air gun as soon as Dr. Linfield pointed out all the pig brain particles floating in the air all around his employees. And then the CEO had that air gun hauled out of the factory on a trolley, never to return. And once that air gun was gone and the factory resumed work, the workers at the head table stopped getting sick. Javier would return to work a second time, but his body was so damaged that he could not actually handle the physical demands of the job. Javier's current state of health, the condition of his family, and his location are unknown. The same can be said for his co-workers, Maria and Carlos. As for the plant, they continue to process pork, slaughtering about 19,000 hogs every day. On a hot, muggy morning in June of 1914, a 40-year-old physician named Joseph G. Goldberger stepped down from his horse-drawn carriage right out in front of a palatial brick building in rural Georgia. He was impressed, but also confused by the grandiose architecture. It looked more like a state capitol than what it really was, a mental hospital. The doctor shielded his eyes from the sun and loosened his collar and fanned his face with a stack of papers as sweat poured down his body. He had traveled all over the world in his work for the United States Public Health Service, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt heat this oppressive. He hoped that once he got inside, it would be a bit cooler. So Dr. Goldberger paid the carriage driver, grabbed his bags, and then marched right up the steps into the front office of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane. The doctor was there on direct orders from the United States Surgeon General to investigate a skin disease called pellagra that was ravaging the American South. The word pellagra was Italian for rough or dry skin, but that name totally understates the danger of this condition. People sometimes called pellagra the disease of the 4 Ds, referring to how it progresses: dermatitis, then diarrhea, then dementia, and then finally death. Until the past decade, there had rarely been a case of pellagra in the United States, but in recent years, it had arrived with a vengeance. And now it was an epidemic. In the American South alone, there were at least 100,000 confirmed cases of pellagra. The U.S. Public Health Service had only been studying pellagra for about 5 years, so they hadn't been able to determine its cause yet, but the leading theory was that it was spread by a type of black fly that feeds on blood. And if that was true, Dr. Goldberger knew he was taking a huge risk coming here. He could get pellagra too. But Dr. Goldberger had been taking risks ever since he was a child, when his family emigrated from Hungary to New York without a cent to their name. And now he was one of the most distinguished physicians in the US Public Health Service, and he had investigated outbreaks of yellow fever, typhus, dengue fever, Schamberg's disease, and typhoid fever, just to name a few. Nearly every time, he'd caught the disease he was fighting. But Dr. Goldberger was a man on a mission. He had to know why there was such a concentration of pellagra cases at places where people lived in large groups, like old age homes, prisons, orphanages, and mental asylums. He decided to start his research at this sanitarium in Georgia, one of the largest mental hospitals in the world with over 3,000 patients, many of which had pellagra. Once the doctor entered the vaulted 4-story entrance hall, he shook hands with the head nurse and explained his plan. He wanted to interview the most advanced pellagra patients first, since they had the most symptoms to study. The nurse led Dr. Goldberger out of the main building, around a fountain, and down a tree-lined road to a 3-story building. She explained that the sanitarium was segregated by gender and race. She was taking him to where the white male patients were kept. They were some of their worst pellagra cases. The doctor followed as she led the way up some stairs and then down a long hallway lined with doors. Moans and babbling voices echoed off the stone walls. Dr. Goldberger glanced through the circular windows on each door as they passed. Patients were crowded several to a room, often with widely differing conditions, from alcoholics to senile old men to people suffering violent psychotic episodes. Some of the patients were there voluntarily, but others were basically prisoners who had been brought against their will. Dr. Goldberger had seen plenty of human suffering throughout his career, but the misery of these men was still hard to witness. Eventually, they stopped at a heavy wooden door. The nurse removed a key from her ring, then unlocked the door and held it open for the doctor. Inside the cramped, low-ceiling room, a tired-looking man sat on a narrow cot. The nurse said he was a local cotton farmer named Henry, and he had one of the worst cases of pellagra at the hospital. Dr. Goldberger flinched at the sharp smell of sweat and body odor inside of the room, and also at the farmer's appearance. His appearance reminded the doctor of medical photos he'd seen of leper colonies in India. The farmer's neck, hands, forearms, and feet were crusted over in this splotchy black mass. As the doctor stepped closer, he could see that the blackness was caused by scabbed-over blood from popped sores. The room was hot and stuffy. The only ventilation was a small window on the far wall. If pellagra was contagious, this was a terrible place to visit an infected patient. But Dr. Goldberger was determined to get to the bottom of this, so he braced himself for the danger ahead and then confidently walked over to the farmer and shook the man's hand. Dr. Goldberger said hello to Henry and asked to hear his story. Henry nodded and then told the doctor that he had admitted himself to the sanitarium a few months ago. At first, Henry thought the rash on his body was just a sunburn, but the rash had continued to spread even when he was out of the sun, and then when the strange, prickly feeling spread to his mouth, he realized this had to be something worse than just a sunburn. He was worried about his wife and his kids catching whatever he had, so he had come here. And this wasn't all. Henry now suffered from near-constant diarrhea. He couldn't sleep much or taste food, and his motor skills were deteriorating. He sighed and said he knew there wasn't anything to be done. The staff had told him that since the cause of pellagra still was not known, that meant there weren't any proven treatments. There was very little they could do to help him. Dr. Goldberger asked Henry to stand up so he could examine him. But when the farmer tried to get up, his legs were so shaky he had to immediately sit back down. Dr. Goldberger was shocked to see firsthand what this disease could do to the human body in just a few months. Henry slowly raised his head to look at the doctor. His eyes had trouble focusing, and he spoke in a cracked voice as he explained his situation. His wife was too busy with their kids to actually manage the farm, and so every day Henry was here at the sanitarium was another day they were not able to tend to their crops. And if he was gone much longer, they would lose everything. Dr. Goldberger stared back at Henry and promised him that he would not stop until he discovered what caused his illness. After leaving Henry's room, Dr. Goldberger followed the nurse on a tour of the rest of the sanitarium. He interviewed dozens of men and women of different ages and races. Each case was tragic in its own way. Pellagra was relentless once it took hold. Seeing children covered in painful sores broke Dr. Goldberger's heart. It seemed like there was nothing anybody could do to help them. But what puzzled Dr. Goldberger the most was just how erratic this disease was. It didn't make sense to him why the pellagra hadn't spread further. In these hot, unventilated buildings, he would have thought entire wards would have caught it by now if it was contagious, but only a fraction of the residents were sick. That night, as Dr. Goldberger went over his notes in his room, he realized that the next step was to interview the staff, all 293 of them. The following morning, Dr. Goldberger was given a vacant office to conduct his interviews. He made sure the survey he would give each staff member was very thorough: how long each person had worked at the sanitarium, which ward they were stationed in, what their interactions had been with every patient, as well as everything about their daily routine. One after another, the staff came in, introduced themselves, and patiently answered every question, and all of them were smiling and very helpful. And for some reason, something just didn't seem right to Dr. Goldberger. An hour into the process, it struck him. None of the staff were sick in the slightest. These were people who worked in buildings full of patients with pellagra, yet none of them showed even a single symptom of having caught the disease. This made Dr. Goldberger wonder, was pellagra really contagious? The prevailing medical theory was that pellagra was an infectious bacteria carried by insects that spread the disease with their bites. If that theory was right, then why were these insects only infecting patients and not the staff? Black flies looking for blood will bite anyone. Dr. Goldberger suspected that something else besides black flies must be causing this disease. In fact, he wondered if pellagra was really an infectious disease at all. He almost laughed out loud with relief. This might be the first time in his career of fighting epidemics that he himself did not get sick. And so if this theory Dr. Goldberger was thinking about was correct, then it was totally useless to make people sick with pellagra stay in isolation. The much more important task was trying to figure out what was causing the pellagra in all these people. Thankfully, the hospital had a telephone. Once Dr. Goldberger wrapped up his interviews with the staff, he called the Surgeon General and received permission to continue his investigation. Dr. Goldberger wanted to inspect another hotbed of pellagra outbreaks, this time at an orphanage in Jackson, Mississippi. And as Dr. Goldberger headed to his room to pack, one of the nurses pulled him aside. She said she had bad news. Henry, the local cotton farmer, had just been found dead inside of his room. Dr. Goldberger shook his head. He wondered how many more people like Henry would die before he could figure out what was causing this horrible disease. Two days later, Dr. Goldberger hurried toward the entrance of the Methodist Orphan Asylum in Jackson, Mississippi, hoping to get out of the blinding sun. He hadn't thought it possible, but somehow it felt even hotter here than in Georgia. And the stakes were a lot higher here, too. Here, the people suffering were children. Children who had no families to comfort them. The orphanage looked far more welcoming than the imposing sanitarium. It reminded Dr. Goldberger of a small country church, with an arched entryway and 2 bell towers above. Inside, the matron who ran the orphanage introduced herself and showed the doctor to his guest quarters in the visitor's wing. After putting away his things, he followed her on a tour of the building. Despite the building's friendly exterior, Dr. Goldberger realized the place needed serious maintenance. As the matron showed him around, he could see cracks in the ceiling, and the bathrooms smelled swampy, like they'd recently flooded or had plumbing problems. The staff was also quite small compared to the number of kids they were caring for, but the kids were relatively well behaved and happy. The doctor poked his head in one of the dormitories and noticed the majority of the beds were made. When they approached the hospital ward, the matron warned Dr. Goldberger to brace himself for a very unpleasant sight. The ward was a long, low room lined with narrow beds, almost like an army barracks. Fully 1/3 of the orphanage, 68 kids, were isolated here because they all had signs of pellagra. In some kids, the pellagra rash had spread up their neck and onto their face. As Dr. Goldberger followed the matron through the room, a particularly sad-looking girl who looked to be about 8 years old caught his eye. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed holding a book. Dr. Goldberger noticed stripes of red sores creeping out beneath the cuffs of her sleeves. The doctor sat down next to her and asked how she was feeling. The girl said she couldn't sleep anymore because her body constantly itched all over, and whenever she scratched it, her skin burned like it was on fire. She peeled back the collar of her shirt to show him. Her neck was ringed in a dark, scaly rash. Dr. Goldberger patted her hands and told her to stay strong. He was going to do everything he could to help her. She nodded, but she did not seem convinced. As Dr. Goldberger looked around the ward, he realized that nearly all of the kids were within a couple of years of this little girl's age. He saw almost no preschoolers or teenagers, even though the orphanage provided homes for kids from birth to age 18. Dr. Goldberger was puzzled, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Dr. Goldberger stood up and followed the matron outside to where a group of older children were helping build a storage shed. The matron explained to the doctor that that was today's chore. As Dr. Goldberger watched these teenagers sawing and hammering planks of wood out in the sun, he was struck by the contrast between them and all the younger children inside the hospital ward. These older kids looked so happy and healthy, and none had even the faintest sign of pellagra. The doctor jotted down some observations in his notebook and then followed the matron to their final stop, the nursery. Inside, it was loud and crowded, with infants and small children scattered all about. Some were playing with blocks and old weathered toys, while others napped on cots. The room felt hot and chaotic, but as Dr. Goldberger studied these kids, he couldn't see any signs of sickness. They were just maybe a bit dirty, like you'd expect active kids to be, and so it comforted Dr. Goldberger to see some signs of normalcy here. After dinner, the doctor stayed up for a while organizing his research. He was beginning to see strange patterns in who got pellagra and who didn't. At the sanitarium in Georgia, pellagra had struck people from every age group, from grandparents to young kids. But here, at this orphanage, all the pellagra patients were the same age group, between 6 and 12. This was new. He'd never encountered a disease before that only affected people of certain ages. Dr. Goldberger now felt confident pellagra was not spread by black flies, but he had a new riddle to solve. Why would infants and older kids not get pellagra while the kids in the middle of those two groups were getting so sick? Dr. Goldberger laid in bed, thinking in circles and listening to the drone of cicadas outside. But he couldn't sleep. He just couldn't get those faces of the kids in the sick ward out of his mind. The next morning, Dr. Goldberger woke up early, gathered his notes, and called a meeting with the matron. He wanted to know every detail of how the kids at the orphanage were cared for, from daily activities to sleeping arrangements to meals. The matron explained that they tried to make the kids' lives as normal as possible, but it had grown more difficult in recent years because of cutbacks to the orphanage's funding. The staff had been forced to ration the more expensive foods. For instance, now only the youngest kids were given milk, because it was essential to their growth, while all the other kids went without it. The staff had also begun assigning chores to the older kids. The orphanage needed constant repairs, but because of these cutbacks, they could no longer afford to hire outside help. And so in exchange for their labor, the older kids were given bigger and better meals, including meat and vegetables, at least once a week. By comparison, the kids in the middle, between ages 6 and 12, ate mostly cornmeal with molasses. On rare occasions, they got whatever low-quality meat the orphanage could scrounge up. They got almost no milk or vegetables at all. Dr. Goldberger was stunned. The kids in the 6 to 12 group were not getting enough to eat, and they were overwhelmingly the ones getting pellagra. Of course, he knew that a bad diet could lead to health complications, but it didn't make sense that it would cause something as horrible as pellagra. The doctor then asked the matron if there were any kids in the 6 to 12-year-old age range who showed no signs of pellagra. Unfortunately, almost all of the kids in that middle age group had at least some symptoms of pellagra. But then she smiled and said actually there were a few kids in that age group who were totally healthy. They were 3 troublemaking 12-year-olds named Charlie, Henry, and Frank. That was not what Dr. Goldberger wanted to hear. If some of the kids eating this terrible diet were not getting the disease, then food had nothing to do with who got sick. The matron led the doctor outside to a courtyard where the 3 troublemaking boys were running around playing tag. None of them looked sick at all, even though they lived in a facility full of kids their age ravaged by disease. So what made these three special? Dr. Goldberger walked up to the three kids and asked how they'd been feeling lately. The boys looked at each other, confused by the question, then shrugged and ran off to continue their game. The doctor smiled. Disinterest was a normal reaction for happy, distracted kids. They clearly were not worried about their health. So the doctor thanked the matron and then headed back to his room, wondering if Charlie, Henry, and Frank held some secret to avoiding pellagra. And if they did, he desperately needed to know what it was. Dr. Goldberger stayed up late that night trying to solve the riddle of the three healthy boys. He combed through all the existing research on pellagra, searching for an answer for why they were not getting sick. He got so lost in thought that when he finally looked up, it was almost midnight. He decided a little breath of cool night air might help him sleep easier, so he got up and left the room. But just as he closed the door and stepped into the hallway, Dr. Goldberger heard hushed voices. In the otherwise silent orphanage, the sound echoed. He held his breath and listened. There they were again, whispers and then footsteps. The doctor tiptoed towards where the noise was coming from, and he peered around the corner just in time to see the doors to the cafeteria's kitchen swinging shut. The doctor crept along the hallway to the cafeteria entrance, and when he got there, he put his ear up to the door, and he could hear inside the cafeteria cupboards opening and excited voices muttering. The doctor peeked through the gap between the double doors, and he stifled a laugh. The three boys from earlier, Charlie, Henry, and Frank, were raiding the pantry. Dr. Goldberger was tempted to leave them be, but he realized that whatever they were eating might explain why they had not caught pellagra. So he slipped into the kitchen and cleared his throat. The boys instantly spun around, embarrassed looks all over their faces. They'd been caught red-handed, and there was no hiding it. But Dr. Goldberger immediately assured them that they were not in trouble. In fact, he said, they could actually be a big help to him. All he needed to know was what they were eating. If they told him, he'd go back to his room, and this could be their little secret. The boys exchanged confused glances, and then nodded to each other. They went to the pantry and pulled out the food they'd been stealing. A few peaches, a handful of peanuts, and some leftover chicken. Dr. Goldberger smiled, and then, in a conspiratorial whisper, asked them if they'd done this before. The boys' faces went red, and they looked down at their feet, and then one of them quietly admitted that yes, they had. Dr. Goldberger felt a surge of excitement. He thanked the boys for their honesty, then left them to their midnight snack. As the doctor headed back to his room, his mind spun with activity. He knew he was close to a breakthrough. By morning, he had devised a plan to test his theory. If it worked, he could finally solve the mystery of what was causing pellagra, and he could save countless lives. But Dr. Goldberger's experiment would take a little patience and more than a little danger for the people who actually took part in it. 8 months later, in February of 1915, on a pleasantly cool Mississippi morning, Dr. Goldberger stood outside of a brick building that looked just like a castle, complete with turrets and battlements. This would be his new home for the next 6 months, and where his grand experiment would take place, Rankin State Prison Farm. He needed a controlled environment for his test to be scientific, and this place was as controlled as it got. To date, there had been 0 cases of pellagra at this prison. But if the doctor's theory was correct, that would not be the case for much longer. Dr. Goldberger regretted what he was about to do. Pellagra killed about 1 out of every 30 people, and if he wasn't careful, his experiment could cost lives. But he didn't feel like he had a choice. People were counting on him. Already, dozens of his patients at the sanitarium and orphanage had died, and the pellagra outbreaks at those locations were not showing any signs of slowing down. So Dr. Goldberger went inside, and the warden then led him to the setting for his experiment, a prison within the prison. It was a private, newly built barracks with barred cells, a cafeteria, and a small screened-in yard. Throughout the experiment, the inmates here would have no contact with the rest of the prison population, so there could be no contamination. In exchange for agreeing to be a human guinea pig for 6 months, the 11 prisoners in the experiment would be given full pardons, $5, and a new suit. The warden then gave his sign to his staff, and the prisoners were brought in. 11 hardened men in pinstripe jumpsuits. Dr. Goldberger watched them file in for breakfast, taking a plate of food from the cafeteria workers and then settling in at a long table. Everyone was tense and alert, like nobody knew what to expect. But once they began eating, the mood turned festive. They cleared their plates, went for seconds, and cracked jokes about how lucky they were. This was a vacation compared to what they were used to. But Dr. Goldberger knew that if his experiment worked, the next 6 months would be anything but relaxing. Because if his suspicions were correct, then these men would contract pellagra and all the horrible suffering that came with it. Almost 6 months later, Dr. Goldberger woke early in his room at the prison and pulled out his calendar. It was the second week of September. The experiment's deadline was approaching fast, and he wasn't getting the results he had hoped for. In 6 weeks, all the funding for this would end, the barracks would be dismantled, and the prisoners would walk free. But there really was nothing Dr. Goldberger could do to make things move faster. The experiment had to move at its own pace. A few inmates had complained of some new ailments, headaches, backaches, dizziness, nausea, but they were nothing that could be pinpointed as pellagra. Just then, a guard knocked on the door and said there'd been an incident with one of the prisoners, who was now restrained in his cell and demanding to talk to the doctor. Dr. Goldberger followed the guard to the prisoner's cell, and as soon as the inmate caught sight of the doctor, the inmate began yelling. He called Dr. Goldberger a crook and shouted that he'd rather just serve his entire sentence back inside the regular prison than stay another second in this hell. Dr. Goldberger was not surprised. The joyful mood from the beginning of this experiment had totally worn off. Many of the inmates were grouchy and irritable, and he was getting yelled at a lot. Dr. Goldberger watched the prisoner thrash against his restraints and howl, when suddenly the doctor caught a glimpse of something through a tear in the prisoner's shoulder seam. The doctor called for the guards to come open up the cell, and then once they had, Dr. Goldberger rushed in and stretched that rip in the prisoner's shoulder even wider, and when he did, boom, there it was. A scaly rash stretching along the prisoner's shoulder blades and up around the base of his neck. Dr. Goldberger then pulled up the prisoner's shirt, and the man's torso was a trail of blackened rashes and pimply sores. There was no doubt this man had pellagra, and he didn't catch it from another prisoner or from the guards. This man must have gotten pellagra from Dr. Goldberger's experiment. Dr. Goldberger asked the guards to please send all the other inmates back to their cells. The doctor wanted to do a full-body checkup on each of them. Once all the prisoners were ready, Dr. Goldberger slowly walked along the cell block, scanning each prisoner from head to toe, and as he did, his pen was a blur in his notebook, furiously scribbling detailed descriptions. The doctor couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hands were shaking. 5 more men had clear symptoms of pellagra, meaning 6 out of the 11 volunteers had caught the deadly disease. Dr. Goldberger dashed back to his office and quickly sent word to the governor. His experiment had worked. Now it was time to tell the world. What Dr. Goldberger had discovered was shockingly simple. Pellagra was not caused by black flies transmitting a virus or bacteria, and pellagra was not contagious. Pellagra was caused by food. Specifically, it was caused by the traditional American Southern diet in poor households: salt pork, molasses, and cornmeal. If that was all somebody ate, it was highly likely they would get pellagra. And people who supplemented this traditional Southern diet with things like milk and vegetables and fresh meat would not get pellagra. Once these results were published, there were mixed reactions from the scientific community. Some wanted to nominate Dr. Goldberger for a Nobel Prize, but just as many doubted the experiment's results, in particular doctors and officials who lived in the American South. They felt like this northern doctor was criticizing their entire way of life. Dr. Goldberger was frustrated that people were questioning his discovery. After all, he had proven it with the experiment he ran at the prison. The prisoners who had volunteered to be a part of it had followed a strict diet of biscuits, gravy, cornbread, grits, rice, syrup, collard greens, and yams. They could eat as much of these foods as they wanted, but no other types of food. And this diet is what caused half of the prisoners to develop pellagra, just like the residents of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane and the children between the ages of 6 and 12 at the orphanage. They all got pellagra from their diet. Still, while Dr. Goldberger had proven that a better, more varied diet was enough to prevent pellagra, he had not actually figured out why that was. It would take another 20 years until scientists actually proved what caused pellagra. It is caused from a deficiency of vitamin B3, also known as niacin. The traditional post-Civil War Southern diet of dried meat, molasses, and cornmeal severely lacked this nutrient, which is why the region was hit so much harder than other areas in America. But once people started adding niacin back into their diet, mostly in the form of enriched flour, the disease no longer manifested, and almost everyone already suffering from it recovered. All told, over 100,000 people died of pellagra between 1900 and 1940 until it disappeared with the identification of niacin. Sadly, Dr. Goldberger died before this discovery of an unrelated and extremely rare form of cancer. However, Dr. Goldberger will always be remembered because he was the one who cracked the riddle of pellagra and saved tens of thousands of lives.
City lights are fading, lost in this decay. Echoes in the night lead me far away. Whispers on the wind calling out my name. Prayers turn to sin in this endless game. Shadows take the light. In the darkness I am free, searching for a sign in the aching melody. Melody.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.